Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. More than 150 people killed and thousands injured in Southeast Asia after a powerful earthquake struck, with Myanmar's military junta appealing for urgent international help. The US Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife are visiting a US base in Greenland in a controversial trip that comes as President Trump continues to insist that Washington should take control of the territory. The King has been seen in public for the first time since his short hospital visit after experiencing side effects from his cancer treatment. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with political commentator Benedict Spence and columnist at the Daily Mirror, Susie Boniface. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on those front pages for you now. Well, the Daily Express leads on the devastating 7.7 magnitude earthquake in Myanmar and Thailand, claiming the number of people killed could reach more than 10,000. Hell on Earth is the headline in the Daily Star. The Times features the harrowing image of the skyscraper which was under construction when it collapsed in Bangkok. But their lead story is about a couple who've been arrested for complaining about their children's school leadership on a WhatsApp group. The Daily Mail's front page says families are set to face a staggering £1,000 increase to their annual budgets from next week, as council tax, water and energy rates are all set to rise. The Eye leads with new gloomy polling, revealing that the Chancellor could be almost as unpopular as Liz Truss and her budget disaster. Meanwhile, the Financial Times features an interview with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who says it's childish to pick between Trump and Europe. The Canadian Prime Minister and former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has been accused of plagiarising his University of Oxford thesis. He's been forced to deny allegations he copied 10 passages of text for his 1995 doctorate. That's in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Mirror has an exclusive on TV star Paul O'Grady, who filmed a video just 20 minutes before he died, in which he thanks his fans for their support. The Sun splashes on Manchester City player Erling Haaland, who apparently gave the team's mascot whiplash. I'm not going to try to explain that last story, but we are joined tonight by Benedict Spence and Susie Boniface to take us through the newspapers. Welcome to you both, starting with the Daily Express and this disaster in Myanmar in Southeast Asia, 7.7 magnitude quake, many feared dead, and the worst news perhaps to come still. Susie?
Yeah, because a lot of the footage and the pictures that we've seen so far are not from Myanmar. They're from the countries around it because journalists can't get into Myanmar and aren't allowed to operate there. The junta that's in control of that place is the kind of government which is not great with dealing with its ethnic minorities, so we say. And there's a lot of ethnic minorities in Myanmar. It's just a huge kind of melting pot. And in those kind of countries, and I've been in some of them in this part of the world, I covered the 2005 tsunami, and the same thing happened there almost. The first figures of how many dead there are always going to be exponential, and they're never really going to get to the true totals. In countries like Thailand and countries that are on the tourist trail, the numbers will be roughly right, because they're relatively good at counting people and then collecting the dead and sorting them out. In countries like Myanmar, the junta does not count in the first place some of the ethnic minorities, doesn't have much presence in the place where those minorities are dominant in the second place. And thirdly, when there is a disaster, really doesn't count them, really doesn't think they are worth collating and collecting information on and treating with respect after they've died. And so whatever figures that come out of Myanmar eventually, when journalists hopefully are able to get in there and see what has happened, and the junta has actually invited, finally, some neighbouring nations, military and so on, to come in and deliver some help, which they haven't done previously for cyclones and so on like that, as we were hearing earlier on. You may well find that those figures are just, they're a drop in the ocean of what's eventually going to happen because, again, Myanmar's not the kind of country where they've been building and preparing for this kind of thing, even though it's a very active area.
Benedict, are you comforted by the fact that the junta has asked for international help and something that they've not previously done, obviously realising maybe the scale of the potential disaster?
Well, that's the thing. I'm not comforted by it at all. I think if things are that bad, that they're actually prepared to ask the international community for help. I think that gives some semblance of quite how bad things could be, because regimes like that simply don't. As much as anything else, it delegitimises them in the face of their own populations. They don't want to lose face with those people that they're having to sort of try to control, because that's a demonstration that they are weak. To move away from Myanmar, to look at places more like Thailand, for instance, you have the other effect, which is because it is very open and growing very rapidly, it's a key part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. It's sort of on the trail between there and India. There has been a huge amount of very rapid expansion, lots of building in major cities. I mean, we've seen the footage from Bangkok, and we've all seen the footage, of course, of construction sites falling to pieces, of high-rises falling to pieces, because in some countries, like Japan, they have very strict codes about building high-rise buildings to make them, to a point, earthquake-proof, because they're aware of this sort of threat. In other countries where the growth is happening very rapidly and there are not those regulations in place, you will see a lot of destruction and a lot of people sadly losing their lives. A good example of this happening, of course, is in Turkey, where there have been lots of examples there of earthquakes hitting and buildings just collapsing, at the slightest sign of any sort of tremor. So on the one hand, you've got a place like Myanmar, which is sort of very tightly controlled by its government, and hasn't quite had the growth that perhaps it should do. And on the other hand, you have the sort of the boomtown economies, which are going to be suffering just as much because these urban areas, they attract a lot of people in, they work in very unsafe conditions as part of that massive construction push. And that is, of course, where a lot of the damage is going to be centred.
Also covered on the front page of the Star, if we can bring that up. But as you mentioned, with the construction perhaps not being up to regulation, or certainly not being earthquake-proof, it is very, very difficult to see how we can be optimistic about, what the death toll will be.
No, and like you said at the start, the fact that the junta has invited people into Myanmar would indicate that there is no great cause for optimism. And the other thing is that I think people have been kept out of Myanmar for so many years. I'm very fortunate to be in there for a day or so when I was covering the tsunami. And I spoke to people then who were not aware that the tsunami had happened in the country next door a week earlier and that it had killed so many thousands of people in their region. It is a beautiful, beautiful country with people in it who are kept in great ignorance about the outside world and about other things that are going on. So when people do start turning up to offer help, and what conditions they're going to be able to help in and the restrictions the junta's going to place on them in that help and how long they're going to put up with it before they say, no, it's time to leave now, and what impact that's going to have on the population that's there is very interesting, especially it may sort of perhaps even highlight sort of some further atrocities beyond those of the regime that we've already seen.
Lots of complex issues aside from the disaster. Let's move to some domestic politics now. The weekend. Reeves' plan for UK almost as unpopular as a Truss budget. I think last week, one of the papers mocked her up with the lettuce.
I saw pictures of some Americans being mocked up with the lettuce after the Signalgate outrage, and I'd just like to claim slight ownership. I know the person who came up with the lettuce thing at the Daily Star, and I passed it on to him and said, look what you've done, it's gone worldwide. Yeah, so she's terribly unpopular, which is not surprising. She's had some big cuts, then that wasn't enough. She had to come back and make some more cuts, and I think that there's sort of an almost not quite a policy, but a suggestion within government. This is very much Rachel's thing, and we're going to come and stand over here while she does that thing there. And, you know, if it all turns out for the best, then she'll look to be some kind of financial genius at the end of it. I suspect that there will be, when there's a reshuffle, they may find some other task for her, because she will have become so contaminated almost politically by this period in government that if they do ever manage to achieve some growth and the positivity and stuff that they want before they go into the next election, she would be the weight that drags it back down. And so I suspect she's sort of keeping the seat warm for someone else.
Bendit, do you think her days are numbered?
Yeah, I don't think she'll see out the year, to be honest. I think she's Keir Starmer's flak jacket at this point. I mean, you know, it's a dreadful situation. Let's be very clear. As much as I don't think that she or Keir Starmer are doing a very good job, they did inherit a dreadful situation. It was never going to be plain sailing. It was always going to be an uphill battle. And I think that she should have known that, or almost certainly she would have known that she was going to bear the brunt of a lot of the ire. The polling, which is for the I paper, is curious because, as you say, a lot of people feel that they're going to be worse off. They're right about that. But they also feel that a lot of the individual policies are good things. So a majority of the people polled are actually in favour of the cuts to personal independence payments. 42% in favour, whereas 30% were against. People being polled are also very in favour of an increase in defence spending. So even though broadly they say, well, this is dreadful, I feel poor, if you sort of go through it individually, they go, well, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. And I also have to say, when your country and your economy are in a very bad situation, the popularity of a budget is not necessarily the measure of whether or not it's a good idea, because lots of people are going to be feeling worse off in this situation. That is what we've been told and come to understand for a very long time. So, as I say, good to know that overall everybody feels poorer, because they are. But when you sort of dive into the detail, you see maybe it's not so clear-cut as to how people feel about this.
Also on that trajectory, the Mail and headlines that the Chancellor will also not want to be reading, talking about Labour's tax raise and the soaring household bills. Families going to be £1,000 a year worse off. Susie?
Yeah, and, you know, to be fair, we had this kind of front page in the Mail under previous Conservative governments. They gave the Tories as much for kicking on the financial front as they are Labour, but you would be unsurprised perhaps to see them respond this way to a Labour budget. There's a couple of things that have happened this week in Westminster. So the first was something that happened today, which is the Director of Communications. One of them has quit and has decided to leave. Says he's been there for 4 years, decided he's had enough and he's going. But it is kind of seen as like a mini, almost reshuffle behind the scenes of the Downing Street machinery, and that Keir Starmer's trying to change things after, you know, the way it's been handled in the first year. That's parked and done now. We're going to move on to something else. And they've also had a complete nightmare with the Hillsborough Law, which was supposed to be placed before Parliament within 2 weeks' time. And they let the families only see it, I think, so their campaigners see it last week, and it was absolutely disastrous, and they refused to back it, and then they've had to scrap it and start again. And that's partly because, and it's the same reason that they've got this issue with the budget, which is you've got very inexperienced ministers in some cases who are green as grass, in some cases, not all of them, but who are taking advice from advisors and civil servants who are saying, well, you don't want to do this, and you don't want to do that, and that gives me too much work, and could we do this, actually? And, well, that's unworkable, we can't do that, Minister. And rather than ask questions or push it through, they're taking that advice. They're kind of being supine ministers. And so you're having this constant cack-handedness in government, which is part of the thing that the strategy and the communications has been seen to be so bad over the past, 10 months, 9 months. And that change is needed behind the scenes. But it also, I think what Keir Starmer needs to do is to have a change that voters can see, that can see him actually taking some charge of this. So with the Hillsborough Law, he made some phone calls. He's heard about it personally and said, right, we're doing this, doing that, scrap that, we'll change the other. And that's what needs to happen, I think, with Rachel Reeves, with some of the policies that have gone down so badly with people, the winter fuel payments, some of the PIP cuts and so on. You can have a reshuffle, exert some power, temper some of this, perhaps with incentives to recruit disabled rather than just punish them.
We've run out of time. But I think what you're suggesting is that perhaps he gets rid of his Chancellor. But
well, there's a few people he could get rid of.
Susie and Bendit, thank you very much for the moment. We are going to take a break coming up. Amongst the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Financial Times, as Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni says the idea of choosing between Trump and Europe is childish. Stay with us for more.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest 'Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here. In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
Premier League Running is live on NBC and Peacock as City Pride is on the line with a pair of iconic derbies.
It doesn't get any better.
April 3rd, it's a London derby. Chelsea.
Beautiful goal from Chelsea.
Spurs.
What a game.
April 6th.
Brace yourself, Manchester, for the mother of all derbies.
United.
In the place.
City. The Premier League Running is live on NBC and streaming on Peacock.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, political commentator Benedict Spence and columnist at the Daily Mirror, Susie Boniface. Let's take a look at the Financial Times front page. And Giorgia Meloni, she's discussing the new relationship between the United States and Europe. And basically she's saying that it's childish to force a choice between the two.
Yes, this is part of a big interview that Meloni's done. I think it's the first interview that she's done with a non-Italian paper. She's become Prime Minister, the first major one anyway.
Yes, it is.
And I think she's trying to set herself up here as an alternative to the mainstream opinion in Europe, which is that, NATO could be about to collapse and the transatlantic alliance is dead. She obviously has very close personal ties with Elon Musk. She says in this interview that she herself, as a Conservative, has some similarities in her worldview as Donald Trump being a Republican, and that actually it's not necessarily going to be all doom and gloom, and that it would be sort of quite foolish to sort of throw this up in the air. I think she says somewhere in this interview that some people are being a little bit too, I think it's political, yes, too political about Donald Trump, which is, it's a way of phrasing it.
European leaders.
The politicians.
Yes, she didn't say Donald Trump is being too political with his tariffs or anything like that, but of course that's because presumably she doesn't want to get it in the neck when Donald Trump announces his next round of tariffs. I mean, it's interesting to see her sort of positioning herself as this sort of alternative stance within Europe, this alternative pole. She's been very critical on the subject of European defence, not at all on side with the idea of putting Italian troops in Ukraine as part of any peacekeeping force, for instance, even though she's been very hawkish on Vladimir Putin. But I think her close personal relationship, as I was talking about with Musk, and the sort of the ties that she has to parts of that sort of new MAGA right are interesting, because increasingly you're seeing, and we saw this with J.D. Vance in his Munich speech, once upon a time, the MAGA sort of perspective was very isolationist. Increasingly, it is becoming transatlantic. It sees Europe very much as its sphere of influence. As much as it's happy to cast Ukraine to the wind, it is taking a much greater interest in what happens in Europe. And I think to have allies like Meloni is obviously of very great importance. And, you know, you see, actually...
She was at the inauguration.
She was, and you see actually how sort of...
leave it there. Much more in the 11 o'clock hour. Let's take a look at the weather for you now.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Right, cool and changeable weather will be replaced by something warmer and more settled next week once high pressure builds. It's a chilly but mostly bright start to Saturday morning. A few showers will affect northern Scotland, while thicker cloud brings outbreaks of patchy rain and drizzle to Western Ireland. Thicker cloud, brisk winds and outbreaks of rain will spread across Ireland into Northern Ireland and Scotland through the morning, with some winteriness over the hills. Meanwhile, England and Wales will be largely fine, dry and sunny after that chilly start, with a better chance of seeing the partial solar eclipse. Cloud and patchy rain will push eastwards across England and Wales later on, but the skies will brighten in Scotland and Ireland. And don't forget, the clocks spring forward by 1 hour in the early hours of Sunday. The weather is set largely fine for Mother's Day.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. Qatar Airways sponsors the weather.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died